Hello, welcome to another one of our chats. Today for you, an author who isn't very well known out of his country and whose works might be a bit hard to find in other languages. Access is a bit complicated, but that doesn't mean it's not worth getting to know or sharing with you. By the way, it's great. Speaking of him, we invite publishers who are interested in translating his work. So, this is the book, Josef Pieper. Only the Lover Sings. Only the Lover Sings. Pieper is a German philosopher who lived in the last century. He lived between 1904 and 1997, meaning he lived for 93 years. Quite a long life. He was a Catholic philosopher, and his thinking is closely tied, of course, to his religious line, but at the same time also very eclectic and very respectful of various philosophical perspectives. The foundation of his thought is deeply connected to the world, classical. Therefore, he had great respect and a deep understanding of the works of Aristotle and Plato, but also the scholastic Saint Augustine and, above all, Saint Thomas Aquinas, whom he admired tremendously. He held a doctorate in philosophy, and also in philosophical anthropology, in theology. He was awarded an honorary doctorate from several universities and taught as a visiting professor in the United States, India, Japan, and Canada. His books today have been compiled into 11 volumes, which gather a series of articles, a series of lectures, a series of conferences. Including this book that we are going to work on, it is nothing more than a compilation of 5 conferences. So, these 11 volumes that encompass all of his work, unfortunately, have not yet been translated into Portuguese. At some point, they will arrive. As we like and get to know something, we invite it to come to us. Pieper, much of his work during the Nazi era was persecuted, were destroyed. He was forbidden from publishing his works. His books were confiscated. He had a very critical stance towards Nazism. This led to, after the end of World War II, him being very well received in countries all over the world. And then he had this journey around the world, always with very interesting and strong positions. We have already seen, then, that he has a theological foundation linked to Catholicism, but he has a very eclectic vision. He speaks of the necessity, yes, for philosophy to have a certain relationship, a certain exchange with theology. But don't misunderstand this, because he speaks very respectfully of Eastern religions. He talks about Taoism, he talks about Confucianism, he talks about Greek religion. Orphic, he speaks of the necessity for certain assumptions, or rather, certain standards, parameters, from which philosophy is guided, which are generally external to it. And when a human being recognizes these parameters, they have a lot of freedom. When he consciously embraces the parameters from which he starts, he can even come to question them. When he does not question, when he hides from others and from himself these patterns of ideas, these parameters on which he works, he ends up being enslaved by them and ignoring any other way of thinking. Right. So he has this. We are going to talk a lot about it because that's his style. It's as if you imagined an example I've given in many of my lectures, and it's worth it for you to understand a bit of Pieper's thinking. Imagine you have a sheet of paper with several pieces, several fragments of iron filings on top of it. In other words, a large amount of iron filings scattered around. And I ask you, with any tool, whether it's tweezers, a spatula, whatever it may be, to make those iron filings take on a perfectly round shape. You will have a huge task to accomplish this. It might not end up so perfectly round. And then the little wind, The small breeze that passes by will distort all that shape you built with so much effort. In other words, it won't be perfect and it won't be very long lasting. Now, if before that I place a circular magnet underneath this sheet of paper, when I bring this magnet close, any movement I make with this sheet of paper, the filings will move and take on a shape, a circular shape. And even if the wind comes and shakes the paper, it returns to its place perfectly. In other words, organizing our thoughts, organizing the concepts that come to us, requires that we have some underlying and conscious form. I know that beneath this sheet of paper there is a circular shape, and that's why my thinking is organized according to this foundation. As I am aware of it, if tomorrow or later I prefer a square shape, I can change it. Now, if I'm not aware and I think I organized these filings in this way because it was a discovery I made, and that this is the right way to organize the filings, I become a slave to this hidden premise, to others, and sometimes even to myself. I have no power over it. So, he says that necessarily, from some point in theology, even for those who do not believe in God, that call it nature, that call it dharma, call it whatever you want, there is a premise, a giver of meaning. The ideal is that we have it consciously, that we put it on the table and know what it is, because from there you guide, you organize the thought. Let's never think that thought was organized without any foundation, without any premise, without any base element. You might not know where the person started from, maybe they don't even know, but they started from some base element. And when this is clear, when this is laid out on the table, it becomes much easier to work with and much more truthful, indeed, much more authentic. So, continuing, another thing that's beautiful about Pieper, which I admire greatly, is that he is tremendously honest and clear in his positions, and he places tremendous value on the simplicity of words. I think that's amazing, for obvious reasons, right? We work exactly in this way at New Acropolis. He speaks of the necessity of expressing, having content to express, and doing so in such a way that the form does not hinder the flow of that content. See what he says, literally. No one can doubt simplicity, a virtue increasingly rare in philosophical writings. Simplicity is the hallmark of a philosopher's credibility, and where we don't find it, we should be suspicious. He said, in various passages, that complexity sometimes creates a smokescreen to hide the little content that is there. When there is consistent content, there is a huge interest from the one who holds it to convey it in its entirety to others. This smokescreen of complexity can hide a scarce content. So, he was a great advocate of simple forms. So, if we consider lectures by a philosopher of Josef Pieper's caliber, in this book, you'll be surprised at how simple they are. He has another book on philosophy that I also admire greatly, logically with a bit more volume. At some point, he'll bring it here. He is also tremendously clear and simple, and he knows he has something to say. Therefore, it makes the form a good conductor, a structure and not an obstacle, and he clearly stands in favor of simplicity. Another thing that's very interesting, in Pieper, he talks about philosophy being connected to phenomena, to the concrete, to life, to reality, and not just speculation on the plane of ideas, of concepts, of categories, of a play of placements about ideas, about concepts detached from reality. Philosophy cannot be separated from phenomena, from reality, from life. It has a commitment to life. It's evident that, as a great admirer of Plato, he was certainly strongly influenced by Platonic philosophy, which also makes this very clear and transparent. Philosophy as the art of living. See what he says. Those who truly philosophize know that, Contrary to what many philosophy teachers think, the true object of philosophy is reality. Josef Pieper said, "Don't accuse me." He said it, and now I agree. I give myself the right to agree, because I find all of this very clear. And it's so close to what I myself work on, the institution to which I belong. Work. Philosophy as the art of living, conveyed simply and with content aimed at making life more human. To make the flow of life worthy of providing greater fulfillment to human beings. And that was his thinking, reiterative in many of his works. Thomas Eliot, for those who know, was a great poet, an essayist, actually American, settled in the United States. He does work where he comments several times on Pieper. Josef Pieper was greatly admired by him. And here, then, he makes these comments. Could it be that, regarding these fundamental themes of any philosophizing, the absence of assumptions, proclaimed by so many philosophers, is actually about hiding their assumptions from themselves and the reader? In other words, he borrows this phrase from Pieper and quotes it. In other words, he himself agreed. In other words, the absence of assumptions. Assumptions, it's not just a concealment of assumptions from oneself and from the one who reads or watches, in other words, who works without any assumptions, starting from absolutely nothing. What kind of order could we give to this iron filing? Starting from absolutely nothing. Where would the Constitution come from in some way? From no presumption, no premise. Even if it is not definitive, even if it is provisional, even if it is itself subject to reflection and improvement. Continuing, Eliot says, for Pieper, philosophizing is an existential process that develops at the center of the spirit, a spontaneous act that arises from the inner life. Wow, that's really beautiful. This observation he makes, because exactly what Josef Pieper speaks of firsthand in his work. In other words, there is a center in the human being, an essence. If you don't believe in theological nomenclature, use whichever you prefer, but the human being has a center of identity. This center needs to manifest in human life. And when does he begin to break through that shell he's wrapped in and make his mark on the world? The language he uses is philosophy, the questioning of life's big questions of why. We are here. Where did we come from? Where are we going? What is the meaning of human existence? What does it mean to be human when this essence that exists within us? Often dormant, when it awakens, its language is philosophy. This, basically, is one of the central ideas of Josef Pieper. Quite interesting. His assumptions are very intriguing. It's no wonder there's a special fondness. I confess to you that I intended to wait until it was available in Portuguese to talk to you about this. But I came to the conclusion that when we talk before it arrives, it might be that by talking so much, we spark the interest to bring Pieper to the Portuguese language. Therefore, it's worth it. As I mentioned to you, his work has already been published in several languages, in German itself, in English. A compilation in 11 volumes. One day it will make its way here. The book I'm going to work with you on today, as we've already mentioned, is made up of 5 lectures. And these 5 lectures are deeply rooted in the idea of art. They compiled all these lectures where he deals very specifically with the theme of art, sometimes even more specifically with music. But not just that. In fact, he integrates this need for art within the legitimate expression of the human being and ends up discussing human life as a whole. The 5 lectures are: the first one, work, leisure, and idleness. The second one, learning to see again. The third, reflections on music. The fourth, music and silence. And the fifth, 3 colloquies in the studio of a sculptor. It seems to be a sculpture he greatly admired, and he gave 3 lectures in the studio of this sculpture, which the book does not reveal. Who was it? So, let's work a little to get to know the ideas of each of these lectures that we have summarized here, all very interesting. Truly, Pieper, there comes a certain moment when we start thinking, where can we find a philosopher with ideas, ideas that are truly capable of broadening and expanding our worldview? There comes a certain point when this field starts to become somewhat scarce. We search for ideas, it's like thing. A person dying of thirst in the desert. Water, this thirst, this scarcity of ideas for the philosopher is terrible. And one of the contemporary philosophers whom I consider truly nourishing me with ideas. New ones, not the only one, there are a few others, but one of them is truly Josef Pieper. He will bring up some very interesting things here, which I'm sure you will also really enjoy. So, the first of these essays, Work, Leisure, and Idleness. He will say that life is divided into these 3 sectors. With leisure and idleness being more or less, they end up becoming the same thing. Work is what we do to produce goods, to ensure our survival. But work necessarily has to be accompanied by this free time, this idleness. It needs that. He even quotes Aristotle, who at a certain point says that we work to produce leisure. And then we interpret this. Really bad, isn't it? Because we think of leisure as doing nothing. When, in fact, in other talks, I've even mentioned this. Leisure was tremendously active. The Greek school, the Latin odium, was the opposite of negotium. Negotium, dedicate oneself to the things of the body. The best thing is to dedicate oneself to things of the soul. It's like you have to nourish the center of your being so that you have the fuel to then continue managing the periphery, to continue managing the surface, the mere existence from the essence, from the depth. That eternal duality between being and existing. The fuel for existing comes from being, and this is exactly in that part of life, which is the option, is to choose this leisure, this free time. He will say that this free time is a catharsis of time, producer of goods, in other words, what we need for survival. And this activity is valuable in itself, regardless of results. And it is not a producer of goods, it is a producer of good. Notice that there is a strong presence of Platonic philosophy here, because Plato said that the idea of the good is the one that encompasses all the virtues of the world. All the values and virtues of the world are encompassed in the idea of the good. And that the idea of the good justifies the entire existence of life in the universe, including human life. So, he says that this activity of free time, this leisure, is a producer of good, while work is a producer of goods. And one depends on the other. There is a necessity. We have to be in the world and survive. But we also have to ensure that we know who we are, where we came from, where we are going, so that we are certain that we are here. If we stay only on the periphery, we get lost. We have no reference point. We have nowhere to draw energy, no justification, no motivation. And then we find ourselves lost, trying to find some magic formula that gives people a good reason to keep living. Meanwhile, in truth, we lose the center, this great supplier of energy, which is our center. So, he talks about this activity as one where you engage certain practices like meditation, reflection, connection, and harmony with the laws of life. In other words, he speaks about it in a very beautiful way, leisure. It's a time for you to replenish your sense of purpose. So he says, if you're feeling lost in the world, you'll see that you truly are. You haven't been visiting the center, you haven't had this time. Time that is as important, as vital, as peripheral time, or even more so, because there you replenish your sense of purpose to then go to the periphery and continue doing your work. People who try to nourish humanity from the periphery through the periphery itself generally have work that is of very little effectiveness. How many times, and in our historical moment, more than ever, people are looking for example, a workforce to have the motivation to continue doing what they do in the best possible way, starting from the work process itself. People are becoming increasingly alienated from themselves, from their own identity. Alienation is practically the order of the day. So he says, you need leisure to replenish your sense of purpose. And all the problems, all the illnesses we have stem from people who are absolutely desperate for meaning. Depression is an affliction that haunts humanity today in a painful way. You look at people and realize that they, although they may not express it very well, are desperate for meaning. Then you might say, she's exaggerating. There are many physical aspects to this. I believe that might be the case sometimes, but it's never just that. Everything that is dual has its physical aspect, metaphysical aspect. So he talks about leisure consisting of a receptive openness combined with attentive silence. He calls this sensitization, meaning perceptive openness, where you open yourself up to perceive everything around you. Receptive, to see every detail of the world around you, to learn from it. And this attentive silence allows you to pause the chatter of your mind for a moment. Because if you only stop the body, the mind keeps thinking about the same things the body was doing. And you remain dedicated to the business, to work and have no inner life. So, this ability to impose silence on oneself and have body and mind together, attentive to everything that moves around you. This is also extremely necessary, something called sensitization. So, a person would need these two things to keep getting out of bed in the morning. To look at the ceiling and find a reason to get out of bed and keep going, which would be to fill oneself with meaning, and to become sensitized to perceive the center, the justification for all things. In other words, this is very powerful and deeply philosophical. He found a way to express many of the Platonic concepts, incorporating content from other sources. Evidently, but in a very profound way, he then talks about the fundamental thing that's missing, and I was surprised when he mentioned it. I found this image beautiful, and this one I will always keep with me. He says, you know what is truly missing for human beings? What's missing is celebrating the feast. That's what's missing. Then he clarifies, what does it mean to celebrate the feast? He says the whole periphery loses its meaning. Life falls apart. If you don't know how to celebrate the feast is fundamental. This is something often discussed in anthropology, that every civilization has placed enormous value on its festivals. Some people even joke that Egypt had so many festivals that it's a wonder they found time to build the pyramids. I've heard many ironies like that. We start to realize, oh, there was a deep meaning there. We no longer know how to celebrate the feast. And what is that? He will say that when you retreat to the center, the first thing you have to do, sensitive to the world around you, focused, you have to perceive the meaning, not just your own, but of your life, of the order of things in the world. To understand the meaning of life, to justify, and to learn to do what Stoic philosophy and later Nietzsche revisited, to embrace a more fatty. What is love? Fatty, the love for the fact, for fate, for life as it is. to understand the meaning of the events in your life and in the collective life of humanity as necessary to elevate you to another level of consciousness. Not just to understand, but to harmonize with them, to enter into deep communion with the purposes of life, and to love it as it is. When you enter into this communion and agreement with life, obviously the first thing you achieve is justifying your own life. And then you are able to celebrate the feast. Every festival, every celebration, according to Josef Pieper, is a celebration of life. With its reasons, with its order, in such a way that you perceive and harmonize with this order and enter into communion with it. So, he says, always have the presence of the divine. Whether it's the divine manifested in nature, for example, which is a seasonal celebration, to understand the meaning of the seasons, want to understand the meaning. For example, a birthday party. I found that incredible, wonderful. He says, don't celebrate a birthday party if you're not at peace with life. Because what you're celebrating isn't really your own merit, it's the merit of life. If you haven't understood what life has proposed to you so far, or haven't set out to understand it, you're not accepting what life offers you as the best you could experience, because you don't trust life. You haven't harmonized with life. There's nothing to celebrate, because celebration, first and foremost, has something of consecration, that is, the perception and acceptance of the sacred, something divine. He says, various civilizations placed Apollo there, placed Osiris there. Call it whatever name you want, call it nature itself, but first and foremost, it is the recognition of the sacred order of the universe. You recognize it, you harmonize with it, and then you celebrate. And then comes art. He will talk a lot about this. That it comes to sing the nature of things. That was hidden, and that was brought to Iona at this moment. It comes to, through your eyes, see the profound nature of each thing and communicate it to all those who cannot see for themselves. In other words, art is nothing more than a ceremonial celebration of life, a way to see and share the beauty of life. And if this doesn't exist, there is no celebration, none at all. He says, look, we're really missing out on knowing how to celebrate. And this celebration brings you back to the edge of survival, completely self-assured, confident in yourself, confident in life, confident in nature, capable of seeing beauty in the smallest things you do. If you work, I don't know, putting together a handful of little pieces to assemble something, that starts to have a greater meaning for you, because you went to the center. And when you see the center of yourself, the center of life, you return to life seeing the center of every little thing you do. If you're assembling a small object, you understand its role in someone's life, and how that will add up, how it will bring some level of usefulness, how it will contribute to the greater good. In other words, you saw the good, the idea of the good. You become an expert hunter of good in all things, and what motivates a person is seeing the good. That exists in all things. If he sees nothing, no shadow of good in the things he does, he will never be a motivated worker. The celebration, the center will sharpen your vision for this. So he says, it's really lacking. It's the current world knowing how to celebrate the festivity. We don't do anything. Our so-called celebrations are nothing more than an escape from life. Chaotic. Sometimes, by doing so, we give way to our deepest anxieties. Our worst rebellions, in other words, it's disharmony, not harmony. Of course, this pseudo way of celebrating returns a person to life even more out of harmony than before, in such a way that today, celebrations have no status at all. Celebration has become merely a way for people to indulge in certain pleasures, sometimes excessively. It no longer has any ceremonial meaning. Tell an Egyptian, try to travel in a time machine, approach a classic Egyptian, and say, I live in a civilization that no longer has celebrations. Even when we do it, we no longer remember why we do it. Because I have a lecture that talks about the origin of modern celebrations. And my idea in this lecture was for you to understand why Easter is bringing you St. John's Day, Christmas, and many other things. In other words, even though we preserve the shell, the content is no longer there. That there are still those who want to end it all, because it's just a commercial date, so emptied of meaning it has become. So it seems bizarre. But according to Pieper, one of the things we truly need is to know how to celebrate festivity in everything, in every moment. If we don't know how to do this, art can become mere entertainment, which can even become crude, because it celebrates what coarsens, not what ennobles humanity. It doesn't place him before harmony, but rather before chaos, and celebrates the chaos. So it will be quite restricted in that regard. An art that does not work to make life, in some way, understood, respected, and celebrated, it risks coarsening humanity. He refers to a beautiful moment in mythology when Zeus creates the entire universe, the whole manifestation as we know it, and calls the gods to witness. And he asks them, "Do you think something is missing?" And the gods were dazzled, for it was a cosmos of beauty, of an extraordinary order. He asks, "Do you think something is missing?" And the gods say, "Yes, yes, who is missing these wonders?" And then he, with Mnemosyne, who is the goddess of memory, creates the 9 muses, the patronesses of the arts, who were born to sing the beauty of the manifested universe. He will say, "It's not just the muses, dear friend. The muses are not just the patronesses of art, they are art itself. Art was born for this as well, to sing these subtle and sublime mysteries of life with all their detailed level of manifestation, and allow that, through her eyes, all people can contemplate this essence hidden behind anything that we often consider insignificant." So, the festivity, always accompanied by art, is a harmonizing catharsis that combines and unifies. The festivity, the celebration, is a moment of unity, of unification, that returns you whole to the world. If you don't have this moment, you leave fragmented by fatigue, by stress, and return even more fragmented. Still, because there's nothing more chaotic. And I work with this because I deal with time management and I'm tired of seeing this happen. That people go out to rest and come back more tired than when they left, because they no longer know what it means to break a routine, a mere job to create free time, to create leisure. And many times it creates such an exhausting situation. In what they call counter rhythm or vacations, where they return more tired than when they left, they come back missing work. And this generates a process, often, they say, our current work process. It is very predatory. It exhausts people. I don't know what. Right? There are many situations like this, but isn't there more to it? Furthermore, isn't there a responsibility of ours in this process? In other words, we are not just victims. We are also participants in this process of alienation from the order of life. We no longer have a center. We no longer have celebration. And then he repeats Aristotle's phrase, "We work in order to have leisure." In other words, we organize the world around us. Because you need leisure, it's like being a sculptor. A sculptor looks at the model and goes to the periphery to sculpt the stone. Then he returns to the center, looks at the model, goes to the periphery, and sculpts the stone. If he goes to the center and has no model at all, what is he going to do with the stone when he goes to the periphery? It won't help to create a guidance department for the workers of such a company, if this department hasn't even gone to the center to see the model. It will create rules upon rules to try, as the saying goes, to squeeze milk from stones, because if no one had leisure, No one celebrated. No one saw the model. How can you inspire someone? Do you know what it's like to not have and yet have to give? He says. Javon's music? There's no one who can solve a problem like this. Notice how simple it is, yet it's disconcerting in its beauty. It is truly disconcerting in its beauty. And then he quotes the phrase from St. Augustine that gives this book its title: Only the one who loves can sing. How beautiful! In other words, it's a kind of intimate connection with life, of intimately sharing life's purposes. And now you have something to sing about. Now your voice feels encouraged to expand and produce its most beautiful trills, because you have something to say. It's like a writer. One of the most stimulating things for him to develop his craft is knowing that he has something necessary to say. He has content. He has to find a way to communicate it to the world, to deliver this hieros logos, this sacred word. Therefore, he will find a way to master the form. It's not a technical scheme. It's a deep necessity, human, and he will talk about this. Right there, it characterizes the difference between a true artist and a mere technical performer of an art. He has something to say, he saw, he went to the core, he celebrated. Only those who love can sing. This is then the first lecture he gives. I don't know if you all get excited. I get incredibly excited about Pieper's ideas because he's a philosopher of the people. You give him the most delightful things in the world. All right, great. He'll put it in the fridge. He'll eat it later. It gives ideas, and you will see a child who received a Christmas toy. And that's just so beautiful. This exists in any human being as potential. Give ideas, new, brilliant, constructive, and you will be my great Santa Claus, giving me the most wonderful things I could ever receive. And that's what a philosopher is like. Then he continues in another lecture, also beautiful, called Learning to See Again. He tells that he had been in New York and returned to Europe by ship. And along the way, there were several people who had also spent some time in New York and were returning, discussing the trip. And then he saw what? The people were talking about New York, and it was just a repetition of what the tour guides had told them. They hadn't really seen New York. Then he would approach them and ask, "Did you notice that in front of that university, the campus thoughtfully placed several tables with chessboards on top, nearby? Having an Italian community, they know they enjoy that. They put those chess tables there. I didn't see that, I didn't notice. Did you notice there are little nooks along the streets of New York, all of a sudden, where they create what seem like small plazas, little corners with benches, with plants, so that people can simply sit there and admire the city, instead of just running from one place to another? I didn't see any of that." Yes, he did. He kept asking about these beautiful details he had noticed and jotted down in his notebook, but no one had seen anything. That's the long and short of it. And he realizes once again, it's not the only time he talks about this. To truly see even in the physical realm, because there is a metaphysical vision, but truly seeing things even in the physical realm has become a declining ability in humans, increasingly scarce. Man is so scattered, so restless, his mind spinning around his practical interests. From what can benefit him, he becomes alienated. He is in the world, but his feet are not grounded in it. He isn't seeing anything around him. He selects one thing or another that meets his most selfish, most immediate interests, and only sees that. Or he asks someone to see for him, like a tour guide. So, the guide has already seen it, no need to trouble myself. To see New York and think something for myself, it's already been thought out. And you run the risk of, when you go to say, "I saw this," people may reject you. You're a snob. What are you trying to say? That you observe more than I do. In other words, seeing is a declining ability, even on a physical level. Declining and even disliked. Those who notice details, I keep remembering when I was a child. Even into childhood, it was slightly altered over time. It was kind of invaded by alienation. Do you remember that? What a joy it was to look at details. I remember it perfectly, as if it were today. On the wall, next to the bed in my room, there was a crack that appeared out of nowhere. I don't know from where. I was fascinated to see how that crack grew. It was like the roots of a tree, spreading in a very interesting way. I thought, why are things like this? It looks like a root. Then I would try to get an adult to see it because I wanted to know about the crack in the wall. But it was incredibly interesting to me, staring at all the little details of what was happening in the garden. Even today, I remember the tiny little balls of a fungus, whatever it was, that appeared on a little plant in the garden. I remember its shape. Today, I no longer look at that. Even though I try, I seek, as a philosopher, I no longer have that level of observation, even though I am extremely interested in regaining that. But it's difficult because life alienates us, and we see less and less. We lose the ability to see. He will say that the importance of the artist is very much found at this point. He equips himself, which is what a true artist does. He equips himself to perceive, with fresh eyes, the abundant richness of all visible reality. In other words, there is something in his nature that compels him to look, to see, and to communicate what he has seen in some way. So evidently, the way we look at a landscape, with these eyes dulled by the law of least effort and the what's in it for me mindset, when we look at a landscape, we see almost nothing. Then the artist goes and sees all the details, recreates every tiny detail. You might live with your window facing that landscape the artist portrayed, and you look and can't see everything he saw. And you start to think, well, there's something wrong with the way I see life. Life is fantastic. Look at what he is seeing. Why not me? I remember once someone sent me a comic strip of a man in front of a television saying nothing interesting happened. Today, and next to him, a window with a fantastic sunset. Nothing interesting happened. Today, one of these days, I was heading home, and Brasilia is in a very dry phase, and the drought, everything has two sides. It's the time when the sunset is the most beautiful, the sun in the middle of a somewhat dark sky. It was a ball of fire, a fantastic sight, all blue around it, and that ball of fire setting. I said, folks, if I were to die tomorrow, perhaps one of the things I would regret the most is never seeing something like this again, because it's so fantastic, it's surreal. So the artist sees, he brings to. He touches a bit of the center of all things, and he exposes it so that others can celebrate, so they can see through his eyes, and together with him, celebrate. That's why art has always been associated with celebration, with meaningful celebrations of these great civilizations. Art, dance, music have always been connected. We refer here to the spiritual ability to perceive visible reality as it truly is. This spiritual ability, that is, something transcendent in the true artist. He places himself above the mundane, meaning he has a metaphysical ability to see something very profound behind it, which the dulled eyes no longer see, and return this vision to humanity. To return to humanity the ability to celebrate, to honor life, to understand it, to respect it, to admire it, to work alongside it, in its favor, and not against it, as we so often do in our days. And he says a phrase that I also found wonderful, which he practically closes the article with certainty, no human being has ever seen everything that is visible to their eyes. Surely, no human being has seen everything that is visible and accessible to their eyes. When you start, when you decide, in the environment where you are now, you close your eyes and make a decision, I decide to see. And you start to realize that around you, there's more than just things. There are desires, hidden love, hidden intelligence. Sometimes a little detail of how a lining or a baseboard fits into the corner of a wall, you realize how ingenious the person who did that was. The person's will to overcome adversity, to make materials mold in their hands, so that your house could be built. Love sometimes is in the refinement of details, in doing something well. A small object that sometimes sits on your desk, a pen, which has a little refinement, not related to utility, but to the need to beautify. And the need to beautify is a manifestation of love. It's full of will, love, and intelligence. Around you, at this moment, no man has ever seen everything that is accessible to his sight. And sometimes you feel bored. Bored not with things, with themselves. From their own superficiality, from the superficiality of their gaze. There are different levels of perception. Descending below a certain limit would evidently endanger the integrity of man as a spiritual being. It seems, however, that in our days we have reached this limit. Look, Josef Pieper lived until the 1990s of the last century. In our days, this minimum threshold of perception, below which spiritual life, the essence, the identity of humanity is at risk, has already been greatly surpassed. We are much more alienated than the minimum that could be admitted. In other words, descending below this limit creates danger. It creates the danger of human life losing its meaning, of not finding a possibility of motivation to see ourselves, to see others, to act upon the world, of turning our entire life completely gray, a great monotony. And we have already lowered this level. Look, it's been more than 2 decades since Josef Pieper left us. I assure you that this capacity for vision has diminished even further. I assure you because in these last 3 decades, I've been in the classroom teaching philosophy, and I feel this difficulty growing and growing at a great speed, quite accelerated. And then he will enter the 3rd chapter, the 3rd lecture he gives, which are reflections on music. He will draw attention to something that is very interesting and has always caught much attention, my attention as well. The interest that great classical philosophers of the past had in music. So you will see the enormous interest in music in whom? In Pythagoras and Plato. Plato even goes so far as to define the musical modes that were desirable. He considers music as fundamental, for example, in his Symposium, as fundamental in the education of a people, as fundamental, including to understand the level of civilization a people possess. The level of a state by the music it provides to its people. In other words, it was vital for him. Also Aristotle and Eastern philosophers, we find a lot here. This within Indian philosophy, for example, very strongly. So he says that these philosophers like to reflect on music because, in a certain way, he says that music is a secret philosophizing of the soul. By being so close to the foundations of human existence. Understand this. All artistic forms are necessarily enveloped in a body that is temporal. So, for example, I love Shakespeare's sonnets. I really think it's very well constructed, but it's a challenge for you to understand the rhythm of Shakespeare's sonnets, given that English, especially Shakespearean English, has changed completely. Therefore, the vessel of that message wears out, and you have difficulty understanding. What a sadness it is to try to understand, for example, the marvel that is said to be, for instance, Virgil's Aeneid, given that the language today is different, and you can no longer fully grasp the nuances of that ancient language. Voltaire used to say that anyone who hasn't read the Aeneid in its original Latin doesn't know what beautiful poetry is. And I keep thinking, is that really it? It's a drama, although I love the Aeneid, am not able to understand it in the original Latin in which it was written. So we realize that this perishable packaging doesn't exist in music. What perishable packaging does music have? It is not wrapped in words. There isn't a person who won't understand a melody because it exists beyond the boundaries of space or time. It has a form of expression that can reach a level of comprehensibility. A strange word, hopefully it exists, a level of accessibility, indeed, for any human being, from any time, from any space. So, he says that music is a secret philosophizing of the soul. And honestly, I tell you that many of my classes were prepared with a beautiful melody in the background. And it gives a clear feeling that the words are emerging from within that music. A clear feeling that those ideas were contained there. And that, somehow, for some reason, I managed to reveal a bit of those ideas. I never forget a wonderful idea I had just by listening to a melody, an original thought that I had never considered before, inclusive, and it brought me many great lessons. So, it is very close to the foundations of human existence. Authentic and meaningful music. Very close to the foundations of human existence. In other words, it speaks of harmony, of unity. It speaks of this initial trunk of life, branching out into various paths. All of them reaching for the sun, all of them wanting to bear fruit, all of them generous, all of them beautiful, all of them with this vocation for expansion. In other words, it expresses something that no word could ever contain. The message of a song, I believe you could call upon the best poets in the world and ask them to write a poem about that music. 100 beautiful things could emerge, inspired by that melody, and it would not be exhausted. If you asked 100 philosophers, they too would be able to do the same thing, and it would not be exhausted. In other words, it is a trunk of meaning very deep, and it brings humanity closer to it. Authentic and meaningful music. And he says something interesting, that if you dispense with everything, the sound of the instruments, the tempo, everything, dispense with it all, you perceive something beyond the music itself. It seems like it's a very subtle message that music has managed to express in part. In other words, music, when it is properly admired, it still gives you the possibility to see through it and see something that lies behind it, which it expressed. That is even deeper and more complete than itself. He raises some doubts that I also have, which I find very interesting. Sometimes Pippa talks about things that it's not just me, but we at New Acropolis, I've often seen people question. If we take a beautiful melody by Beethoven, but abstract it from all the elements of its time, it doesn't say it's by Beethoven. Simply a passage, a theme, not well known, but equally beautiful. How many people would be able to perceive some beauty there? Because many times the appreciation of music comes from the label that's attached to it. Beethoven, so I have to like it. In other words, a beautiful musical piece, regardless of who it's by, even if it's by João da Silva, would be authentic and true music. It expresses something very essential about human nature, and you're able to see through it. Not because of the argument of authority, like so-and-so made it, therefore everyone is obliged to like it. Let me tell you, no one is obliged to like anything. Whatever label is attached to it, you are invited to see through it. And if you can see, if you can grasp this meaning, you have the freedom to say, this is profound. But learn not to value things, because some label is hanging, saying, value it. I've seen people say, if you don't like a certain authority, the author is wrong. How so? So, what kind of tyranny is this? There is no tyranny. Any author, no matter how renowned, if you don't see anything through them, they still don't exist for you. And it might be because many people are renowned without having that much quality. It might even be that there's really nothing to see through it. And there comes a time when this becomes clear. This other part that he says is very beautiful. Man's being is dynamic, man is a pilgrim, and his driving force is good. It says that the good, this idea of the good, unifies all things. According to Plato, in this Platonic definition, the good is what unites, meaning it leads all beings to the pinnacle of the pyramid. This force of the good gives you a magnetism, an attraction that makes you feel compelled to move forward. The emotion, the strength, the energy that the idea of the good gives us, even when it is scarcely perceived. Incredible. So, man becomes a pilgrim, a being under construction, when he perceives, even from afar, the idea of the good, which is the most beautiful and complete of all ideas. So he is a wanderer, always in perpetual improvement, and for him, real time exists. Another beautiful thing he says here, every man who seeks the good. Wow, I love this, folks. Maybe. I don't know if you'll value it as much as I do. He says, every man who seeks the good is, in fact, seeking his full ethical development. Look how incredible. And I, who am one of the greatest advocates of ethics, with a need for man to become more human, I had never thought in these terms. It's not that ethics is a tool you use to achieve the good. Ethics is the good itself. It's not that it's a tool you use to reach happiness. It is happiness itself. In other words, he says that the pinnacle of a man's achievement is his full ethical development. Ethics is happiness, not the path to happiness. Therefore, the man who sees this becomes a pilgrim, a being that walks towards its fullness. And this is one of the most beautiful things a man can aspire to be. There is a book that I find very interesting, a Christian book called The Pilgrim's Progress, or in Portuguese, O Peregrino, by John Bunyan. And it shows this, how the true human being, as a consciousness, a pilgrim's soul, is in search of what corresponds to them in the scheme of nature. In other words, in search of being truly human, the fullness of your ethical development. Ethics is in itself the fulfillment. Ethics is in itself happiness, according to our dear Josef Pieper. Another very interesting chapter he talks about, beautiful, he says the following about the good: we cannot speak nor remain silent. Isn't that beautiful? About the good, we cannot speak nor remain silent. We should rejoice with an exultation beyond words, whose name is music. When you realize your consciousness perceives the idea of the good, you can't say anything, but you also can't remain silent. There is something within you that blossoms, that rejoices, and the way this jubilation of the soul manifests is called music. It is the form of language, of human consciousness in the presence of the good. A definition of an extraordinary beauty. He wasn't exactly a musician, just an admirer, and is capable of capturing things so deeply in this way. I find it admirable. The absence of this encounter and its longing can often also be expressed through music, in a legitimate way, a soul that is yearning for the good. Music can also express this because it is a legitimate need. A soul that lacks finding the path towards the good, this can also be expressed through music. But if it has no relation to the human soul and its goal, which is the good, it can be something else entirely, music. In other words, there is a need for this music to give words to the human soul, because the human soul changes, it withers. It no longer has the ability to go to the center, to find itself, to celebrate. Music is capable of opening a path in the realm of silence. It reveals the human soul in its extreme nakedness, without the usual linguistic garments. What he is about to say is very beautiful. So, the human soul opens a path in the realm of silence. It makes you perceptive, it makes you attentive to this multitude of meanings that exist. Mute within this realm of silence. It makes you curious to uncover the meaning of things. This silence that the soul unveils, because music is a combination of sounds and silences, this silence that music unveils. It even allows you to perceive more clearly the other, the beauty of the other, the essence of the other. In other words, it allows for deeper coexistence because it is a revealer of essences, of contents. It fills the silence with a profound, detailed observation of everything that exists around you. In other words, it gives voice to the soul with its needs. Music imitates the impulses of the soul, according to Plato. According to Aristotle, music is similar to ethics and is related to it. Interesting, isn't it? Music, then, is like an inseparable companion to ethics in its art of shaping and perfecting the human soul, and extremely necessary. As those philosophers we mentioned used to say, Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, it's amazing how they address this, and how deeply they address it. He uses a phrase from Nietzsche, equally interesting. Music allows us to hear nature transformed into love. Notice that we listen to nature, often with a completely utilitarian ear. I remember that quote from Tolstoy that I often use. There are those who walk through a forest and see only firewood for their campfire. It means you are listening to nature with the eyes of interest, of selfishness, asking, what use is this to me? And you will only notice this. Music sensitizes your ears so that you hear nature transformed into love. Then you notice all the details, all the refinements, the grand celebration that is nature. I will never forget an occasion when I was in the Amazon and we went to the middle of the river, and there, in the middle of the river, we waited for the sunrise. I never imagined something like that. Nature becomes euphoric when the sun is rising. It becomes euphoric. You can't imagine. The monkeys go wild, screaming like crazy, jumping from branch to branch, the birds all at once. But it truly is a celebration. They recognize the value of the sun's return as light, as life, as nourishment, while humans are still asleep. Life, for them, is a celebration, even if they are not conscious of it. They don't have a reflective consciousness to evaluate this action, but for them, every sunrise is a celebration. And I am amazed because humans are deaf to all these things. In other words, music sensitizes the human ear. Music allows us to hear nature transformed into love. That morning on the Amazon River was one of the greatest demonstrations of love I have ever witnessed in my life. And he continues, then, our friend Pieper, saying, the corruption of music, and its danger was perceived and feared by ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. And look how it was. If you take Plato's Republic, you'll be surprised to see how it was. Value for Plato. He considered music as a call to harmony. In other words, it invites you to resonate along with it, which is the same principle of vibration from the Kybalion of ancient Egypt. In other words, when this call is a downward call, it has the power to lower the consciousness of humanity, of a society, of a community, which is a serious matter. Because whether we like it or not, whether it's authentic music or not, the rhythm, the vibration it generates is a call to harmony. And there was a great concern. Because, according to Pieper, the realm of performance is affected. But the realm of listening is just as affected. In other words, Both the performer and the one who receives these sounds are equally affected. Both lose, both fall into disharmony, which is the opposite of what the arts should generate. So, all these philosophers recognize the fundamental and vital role of music in the formation and improvement of man as an instrument. It is an instrument to shape the character of man and to achieve the proper ordering of the legal structure of society. So, there's no way to organize a society if you don't know what order is. And one of the elements that most invokes a man to perceive order is art. Is music, very particularly. It's no wonder that Plato said he could gauge the level of a state by the music the government provides to its people. In other words, it's an invitation to order or to chaos. And there are many who think this way. So, it's very interesting. You'll see there is a philosopher who, by the way, passed away this year. Sir Roger Scruton, who was, above all, a great composer, a person very sensitive to music. He clearly states that anyone interested in the well-being of humanity must help it refine its taste. And it is art. Art is a path of redemption with little resistance and highly harmonizing. Anyone who is interested in the future of humanity has to begin to appreciate harmony through art, through music in particular. Pieper goes on to say, there will always be noise, but there will also be the ability to choose. Do you understand? The world is dual. There will be music endowed with meaning and there will be noise, but there must be the ability to choose. In other words, the man who aligns himself with the nose. And at that moment, you want disharmony, because sometimes the disharmony within us has an instinct for self-preservation. You don't want to feel well. Seek the noise. But one must know that for those who seek harmony, there is a path that leads them to it. Don't do it for him. But it powerfully invites him. No one can force a person to evolve, but creating the right circumstances for it can inspire change. When good music plays, it stirs within us a desire to dance. Our soul is somewhat like that too. When a beautiful melody plays, it has the desire to come to Iona, to manifest itself and leave its mark on the world. It's no coincidence that, in Japanese mythology, the sun goddess Amaterasu feels invited to leave the cave through dance. Feels invited to leave that dark hole and radiate light through the dance performed at the entrance of the cave. In short, it is an element very present in universal mythology. Meaningful art is like a call, an invitation to recognize the order of the universe, to contemplate, and to commune with the order of the universe, and to celebrate the feast. Music reveals the existential inner state of man. It is necessary, sober, and insightful, the state of alertness that is provoked by music. It's no coincidence that Roger Scruton mentions this, the idea of the reliable observer, which actually isn't his, it's Hume's, who says that if you want to know, in a civilization where there is a musical standard that you don't know very well, what is good music? There, call upon a man of character, well-formed, and ask him. This is the reliable judge, whose testimony is essential. In other words, there is a very close connection between this harmonizing factor and the person who is harmonized, how they feed off each other, how there is a flow there. Another article, Music and Silence. He quotes Lewis, C.S. Lewis, who is Clive Staples Lewis, you might know him, a great writer, poet, theologian, Irishman. Lewis has a quote that Pieper cites, saying, "Music and silence are two realities that cannot be found in hell." Isn't that interesting? Music and silence. They are two realities that you cannot find in hell. Ben Piper comments on this. He will say that hell is filled with infernal noise. Pandemonium, which comes from pan, meaning everywhere, and demons, meaning the demonic noise that creates disharmony. Considering the theological considerations, this pandemonium is right here. We constantly build our own hell. So, only authentic music is capable of creating harmony. And also true, profound silence where a person becomes sensitized, perceptive to the order that exists around them, becomes perceptive even to another human being, and can establish deep and genuine relationships. Authentic music is the only thing capable of creating a particular kind of silence that allows for true listening. When you talk to someone, you sometimes notice that their eyes are empty. She is just waiting for you to stop talking so she can unload onto you something she's already thinking about. She is not listening to you. True music is capable of generating the fertile silence where true listening occurs. Therefore, repeating Lewis' phrase, music and silence are two realities that cannot be found in hell. Another thing I found very interesting and creative. Finally, some details from his last essay, which is the 3 colloquies in a sculptor's studio. These are 3 lectures he gives in a studio. He says the following: the artist should be considered as someone called to be one who safeguards and preserves a sacred reality, recognized through art. In other words, it's like a guardian of the temple, of the sacred, of the role of giving meaning. The sacred, as Eliade said, is the function of giving meaning, and he is capable of perceiving this meaning and communicate it in a way that can touch the human soul and signal a path that brings one into the presence of the sacred. There are arts performed with an extraordinary technical skill, and yet completely empty and without substance. This is Piper speaking, not me, but I agree wholeheartedly. Our historical moment is very much in vogue. For example, virtuoso pianists, whom you hear, not just pianists, but many other performers with different instruments, or even singers, but particularly the trend of acrobatic pianists. It's something I find amusing. You stop to listen and realize it's just a mere key striker, not a pianist. It has no meaning, no content, it's juggling, not art. How many times do you hear someone with impeccable singing technique, for example, and it doesn't say anything to you? And sometimes a little child's voice singing something tells you something. Wow, because it's touching, because there's some meaning she's trying to express there. It's not an empty package. In other words, technical skill doesn't necessarily indicate a good artist. What is the message? What message do you have to give to the world? Otherwise, as Professor Jorge Angel Livraga Rizzi, the founder of New Acropolis, used to say, art becomes an empty envelope without any message. A false art is incapable of radiating any substance. Those who only look at themselves never radiate anything. This is an Oriental proverb that he quotes. Look at this fantastic thing. Folks, pay attention to this. Those who only look at themselves never radiate anything. The artist is someone who seeks nothing solely for themselves and becomes receptive to the mysterious breath of creative inspiration. I return to that phrase by Gibran, which I love so much. We are stations for enriching the gifts of life, but we enrich the gifts of life, not to hold them back, but to blow them across the world, so that they go further than they can, to give our push so they can spread. An artist without generosity, the artist who doesn't temper their selfishness, makes music just to showcase their personality. He doesn't shine, he doesn't sparkle, there's no content in him that can add value to others' lives. and the breath of creative inspiration becomes very stifled. Then, if it even exists. And then he talks about an interesting phrase from a German philosopher, poet, and novelist, Hölderlin, who says, "What use are poets in barren times?" And Pieper responds, "They serve to celebrate the feast, and if they can no longer do so, there is no reason for them to exist. There is no reason for them to exist. There is no way to bring artists to Iona. There is no one capable of being sensitive to the celebration who wishes to celebrate the feast. Any celebration draws its very existence from an attitude of acceptance, approval, and love for life, even a birthday." I reiterate what we said at the beginning. If you're not celebrating life, what are you celebrating on your birthday? Oh, my name? Your name, your personality, is responsible for this portion of life that has been given to you so far. No, nature, life. So celebrate it and make a celebration with respect to this force of nature, call it God, or whatever you wish. And from this understanding and communion with the spirit of life, sing, only the lover sings. There can be no celebration without a song and without the fine arts as a whole. Classically, in civilizations, it has always been this way. Both are based on the loving acceptance of the world and human existence. In other words, the arts are born to celebrate the loving embrace between human consciousness and the laws of life. And from this communion, the voice that sings emerges, rather than mere noises, even if technically well executed at times. Pieper continues by saying, Plato describes the feast as a breath gifted by God. And he states that the muses appear as guests at all celebrations. In other words, those first muses who were called to sing the cosmos. Every time you celebrate life, they are necessarily present on the guest list. And art is not simply the expression of the muses. They are the muses themselves, singing the celebration and communion of man with nature. All art brings to Iona the festive aspect of the world and existence. How beautiful! If I were an artist, I would write this on my closet. All art brings to Iona the festive aspect of the world and existence. He quotes a phrase from Anaxagoras. Why are you here in the world? To contemplate. Ultimately, that is why we are in the world. To contemplate. And for us to become increasingly creators of celebration, and through celebration, capable of bringing this contemplation closer to those who see beauty, will, love, and intelligence through our eyes. In other words, the world becomes more contemplative through those who understand the heart of the world. Through art. The world becomes more contemplative. There is more to do in the world. The heart of man is more fulfilled. And finally, he quotes an author I love, and about whom I've even given lectures, which is Teilhard Chardin. He talks about this phrase from Teilhard Chardin, a very interesting book, which is The Phenomenon of Man. The entire evolution of the universe has as its ultimate goal to enable an ever more perfect vision, that is, perception. You came here to see, to contemplate, and for that, the muses assist you. The ultimate reason, the final purpose of the entire evolution of the universe, has as its ultimate goal to enable an ever more perfect vision. We must learn the archetypes of all that is. We must grasp the archetypes of all that is. The things around us, at this moment, at least they are. We must understand their archetypes, the idea that generated them. And for that, one must contemplate. To have depth in order to contemplate things deeply. Remember what our friend Baltasar Gracian said in a recent lecture we gave here on the YouTube channel. Better intense than extensive. All the things around us are there to be contemplated. And human consciousness bursts to understand the idea that generated all things. There is an ancient expression from the mystics, which Pieper cites in conclusion, which is ubi amor ibi oculos, meaning the eyes see better when guided by love. In other words, the celebration is a loving call to see, to contemplate, which allows us to go to the periphery. Nourished by the center, and life is entirely illuminated with meaning. And artists are incredibly important priests of all this. This is basically a summary of this book. I hope you all enjoy it. To me, it moves me all the time. I find it incredibly beautiful. I hope it can provide a good reflection for you all. It's a very refined philosophy, very deep, and I hope it makes sense to you all. Hello there. I hope this message finds you well. I just wanted to send you a big, warm hug and check in to see how everything is going on your end. It's been a while since we last caught up, and I'm genuinely curious to hear about what's new and exciting in your life. How have you been feeling lately? Are there any recent adventures or experiences you'd like to share? I always enjoy hearing about your journey and the things that bring you joy. Please feel free to share as much or as little as you like. I'm here to listen and support you in any way I can. Looking forward to hearing from you soon.